The fluorescent lights hummed their 2 a.m. song at Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego, a frequency that only the night shift nurses heard anymore. Brooke Sullivan sat in the empty nurses' station, her penmanship precise as a surgeon's incision, each medication note documented with the kind of detail that made the pharmacy director ask fewer questions. She didn't need to be noticed. She had learned that lesson across 12 years and 4 tours. Invisibility was a tactical advantage, and she wore it like body armor under her scrubs. Her left leg ached. It always did after a shift longer than 8 hours, a dull throb that started in the hip and radiated down to the ankle, a reminder of Helmand Province that her body refused to forget. She adjusted her position in the chair, weight shifting to the right side, movements fluid enough that no one watching would think anything of it. No one was watching anyway. The night shift meant skeleton crews and patients sleeping through medication rounds, which meant Brooke could work the way she'd been trained, silent, methodical, invisible. When she reached for the 4 supplies on the high shelf, her scrub sleeve rode up an inch. 3 thin lines, pale against her skin, running parallel like a barcode. Shrapnel pattern. Not quite 3 inches long, but precise enough that someone who'd seen field hospitals would recognize the trajectory immediately. She tugged the sleeve down before anyone could see, a motion so automatic it had become reflex. Some things didn't need explaining. Some scars just needed covering. Her locker was 3 doors down from the pharmacy station. She keyed the combination 0-for-2-7, her daughter's birthday rearranged, and the metal door swung open to reveal the uniform of her civilian life. A jacket she'd bought 5 years ago and never worn because the seams felt wrong against her shoulders. A pair of jeans that hung too loose. And beneath it all, wrapped in weathered canvas like something sacred, a pair of combat boots. Desert tan, salt-stained from sweat and something darker, scuffed at the heels from 1,000 forward movements across terrain that was never the same twice. She had wrapped them in cloth 6 years ago when she'd hung up her rank, when she'd decided that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan would stay overseas and this shell of a person would come home to San Diego to raise a daughter alone. The boots stayed wrapped. Some days she almost forgot they were there. A pharmacy tech named Danny appeared at the locker room entrance, holding a bottle of ibuprofen like a question. "You ex-military?" he asked, casual enough that it should have felt like small talk. It didn't. Brooke's hands froze for half a second. Her fingers, which had sutured wound edges under mortar fire without trembling, which had held a compress against a brachial artery while rounds kicked up dust 6 feet away, which had moved through 18 years of controlled precision, went completely still. She made the freeze last exactly 1 beat, long enough to cover it, short enough to seem human, and then she opened the ibuprofen bottle with steady fingers and shook 2 tablets into her palm. "Just careful," she said, turning to face him. Her voice was soft, the kind of soft that didn't carry authority or demand attention. It was the voice of someone who wanted to be forgettable. Attention to detail. Helps with the work. Danny nodded, satisfied with the non-answer, and disappeared back toward the pharmacy. Brooke closed her locker carefully, making sure the canvas bundle stayed hidden beneath the civilian clothes she'd purchased 6 years ago and never worn. Her daughter's photograph was taped to the inside of the door, Maya, age 12, missing 2 teeth in a way that made her grin look genuinely happy, the way Brooke remembered grinning before Helmand Province taught her to economize emotion. The night supervisor, Margaret, appeared with the shift briefing clipboard, her scrubs wrinkled in the way of someone on their 4th consecutive overnight. "Trauma bay for cleared," Margaret said, running through the station notes like a pre-flight checklist. 2 admits in pediatrics with possible flu. 1 cardiac observation in ICU, vital stable. And tomorrow Dr. Sterling starts in emergency medicine. Margaret made a face, the expression of someone about to take a punch they could see coming from 3 blocks away. Corporate hire. Some hotshot from LA with a private practice background. He's already called twice about protocol changes he wants to implement immediately. Brooke continued charting without looking up. Her pen moved across the page in the same careful script, documenting medication times and vital signs and patient responses with the precision of someone who understood that these notes were a legal record, that they mattered in ways civilians didn't always grasp. She had learned that in Helmand Province too, documentation was survival. Documentation meant accountability. Documentation meant the difference between a court-martial and a medal. His office called ahead requesting a meeting with all department heads. Margaret continued, her exhaustion audible in the way her voice flattened at the end of sentences. Wants to assess current operations and identify inefficiencies. Those were the actual words his assistant used. Inefficiencies. She took a sip of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. Welcome to the new hospital, where nurses are apparently inefficient. Brooke said nothing. Silence was also a tactical advantage. She had learned to let people fill it with their own conclusions, their own assumptions, their own interpretations of what she might be thinking. Usually they were wrong. Usually they projected weakness onto someone who simply refused to perform emotion on demand. The clock shifted to 2:56 a.m. 3 more hours until the day shift arrived and the fluorescent hum changed registers, became busier somehow, as if the hospital itself tensed when daylight approached. Brooke finished her charting for the West Wing and began the evening medication rounds. She moved through the corridors like someone who knew every step of the route without thinking, her movements efficient and purposeful. In one room, a patient recovering from appendectomy. In another, an elderly woman with pneumonia, her oxygen saturation holding steady at 92%. In the cardiac observation unit, a post-MI patient whose EKG had stabilized 8 hours ago and whose morphine dose was due at 3 a.m. She didn't think about Dr. Sterling. Didn't think about the corporate hire who would arrive tomorrow with his private practice background and his protocol changes. Didn't think about the way systems collapsed when people with credentials but no wisdom decided that their experience mattered more than the people who actually knew how to keep patients alive. She had learned to compartmentalize that kind of thinking. Combat medics didn't have the luxury of worry. They had the luxury of competence, of steady hands, of understanding that the moment you doubted yourself was the moment someone died. But her fingers tapped her thigh 3 times at 2:53 a.m. when she returned to the nurse's station. Tap tap tap. A rhythm she hadn't used in 6 years, hadn't needed since she'd left the service. A rhythm that meant stand by, stand ready, stand down from whatever you're thinking about because something's coming. Her daughter would be asleep now, sprawled across her bed in whatever configuration kids naturally fell into, her homework folder open on the nightstand because she'd forgotten to close it again. Brooke would check it in the morning. She would ask about the math test. She would make sure the teacher was understanding about the accommodation request because her mother couldn't sit in a crowded school auditorium anymore without her hands learning to shake for the first time in her life. The next words came through the intercom at 3:14 a.m., neutral and efficient. Ambulance arriving Trauma Bay 2. 22-year-old male, IED training accident at Camp Pendleton, multiple shrapnel wounds, estimated arrival for minutes. The shift suddenly changed frequency. Brooke heard it in the way Margaret's breathing sharpened, in the way the pharmacy tech moved from casual to purposeful, in the way the room itself seemed to hold its breath. An IED training accident. Which meant a Marine. Which meant someone from the base 20 miles north, which meant the hospital had been expecting casualties but hoping it was just preparation work, just drills and scenarios that never actually materialized into bleeding human beings on stretchers. Brooke stood up from her chair without conscious thought. Her body knew what to do when combat came, even if combat was only in the memory of other people's flesh. Trauma meant systematic response. Trauma meant the hierarchy of need, the triage logic that separated the dying from the merely hurt. Trauma meant hands that knew exactly what they were doing, and she had hands that knew. She was in Trauma Bay 2 before the ambulance arrived, before the sirens wailed closer, before the automatic doors opened and the paramedics wheeled in the stretcher with the urgency of people who understood that minutes mattered. The young man on the stretcher was conscious, his uniform dark with blood that looked almost black under the fluorescent lights, his jaw clenched against whatever pain medication the field unit had given him. Shrapnel wounds across his left shoulder and ribs, the kind of patterning that meant proximity to the blast, that meant luck and trajectory had been measured in inches. 22 years old, E3 rank, training exercise gone wrong, the paramedic said, rattling off vitals with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times. BP 120/80, holding. Heart rate 102. Respiration 18. 2 liters O2 via nasal cannula. We've got for 4 lines established, 2 units of O negative running. The attending physician from the ER looked at the wounds and made the calculation that ER doctors made, not immediately life-threatening, needs emergency suturing, needs imaging to rule out deeper trauma. Get him to room 3. I'll do a full assessment. The doctor moved away with the confidence of someone who saw trauma as a puzzle rather than a catastrophe. Brooke moved with him, her role now clear. She would assist with suturing. She would monitor vitals. She would do what she had been trained to do across 12 years of military medicine, the kind of training that didn't disappear just because you hung up the rank and pretended to be a regular nurse at a civilian hospital in San Diego. The young Marine, his name was Corporal Jensen, according to his ID, was watching her hands as she positioned the suture kit. He was watching the way her fingers moved, the way she organized the instruments in the exact sequence they would be needed, the way she anticipated what would come next without having to ask. His eyes were clear, focused, the expression of someone looking at something familiar in an unexpected place. "You were a combat medic," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've seen that exact technique in the field hospitals. In Kandahar. In Camp Leatherneck." Brooke's hands kept moving. She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She did her job with the precision of someone who had learned that the moment you acknowledged your past was the moment civilians started asking questions that had no good answers. The attending doctor was preparing the suture line, was beginning the delicate work of bringing the wound edges together, was doing exactly what needed to be done. But Corporal Jensen's words had landed somewhere that 12 years of compartmentalization hadn't quite sealed off, had opened a door that 6 years of invisibility had kept locked. The door to the cafeteria swung open at 11:51 a.m., and Dr. Sterling walked through it like he owned the tile beneath his shoes. Tailored charcoal suit. Cologne that cut through the antiseptic smell like a blade through gauze. His shoes, Italian leather, probably $400, clicked against the floor with the precision of a metronome counting down someone's career. He'd been at Oak Creek Memorial for exactly 3 days, and already the hospital moved differently when he was in a room. People straightened. People smiled. People looked away when he looked at them. Brooke Sullivan did not look away. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a choice, and choices were what kept you alive. The morning rounds had been surgical, Sterling moving through patient rooms with the efficiency of someone who'd memorized the script before he arrived. He stopped at the nurse's station around 10:15, where Brooke was charting post-op vitals on a 68-year-old woman recovering from a cholecystectomy. Sterling's shadow fell across her keyboard first. She felt it before she saw it, the way her body had learned to sense things in dark places. "Sullivan, right?" His voice had the smooth texture of motor oil over gravel. Brooke looked up. Met his eyes. Said nothing. "Let's make this interesting." Sterling leaned against the counter, his Omega watch catching the fluorescent light. "I bet you $100 you quit within a week. Quiet types like you always crack. Something about the pressure, the schedules, the blood." He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "I've seen it 100 times. You'll last till Friday, maybe Saturday if you're stubborn. Then you'll realize you're not cut out for this." The other nurses pretended to work. Their shoulders tensed. Their typing became very loud, very deliberate, very much not paying attention. Brooke took one measured breath. Her hand stilled on the keyboard. She raised her eyes to his and held them there, steady as a surgical laser. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, but from the weight of 4 years of silence suddenly pressing down like a hand on her chest. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, one finger against her cheekbone, methodical and controlled. Sterling waited for her to respond. To defend herself. To crack. She didn't. "Well," he said finally, straightening his suit jacket. "We'll see." He walked toward the coffee station. Brooke returned to her charting. The other nurses gradually returned to breathing. By day 3, Dr. Sterling had completed his psychological mapping of Oak Creek Memorial staff hierarchy. He knew who had student loans, who had ex-spouses and alimony, who desperately needed his recommendation for better positions. He knew exactly where the pressure points were, and he applied them with the casual precision of someone who'd learned that power wasn't about being loudest, it was about being the one who set the rules. Brooke carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria at 12:33 p.m. Turkey sandwich, apple, a container of yogurt she'd brought from home because hospital yogurt always tasted like plastic and regret. The tray was full but balanced, the way she'd learned to carry things when space was tight and collateral damage had to be minimized. She navigated the crowded tables toward an empty corner near the windows. Dr. Sterling stepped directly into her path. He didn't bump her accidentally. That was the cruelest part of it, the calculation. He could have made it look like an accident. Instead, he made sure she saw it coming, made sure she understood it was deliberate, made sure 30 staff members watched as her tray tilted at an impossible angle and soup splattered across the tile floor in a Jackson Pollock of humiliation. The turkey sandwich landed face down. The apple rolled 3 feet toward the trash can and stopped. The yogurt container split open, its contents spreading across the tile like a white stain of shame. The cafeteria went so quiet you could hear the refrigerators humming in the kitchen. "Oh, sweetheart, you should be more careful," Sterling said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Clean that up." 30 eyes found Brooke. 30 people held their breath. Brooke Sullivan knelt. Her knees hit the tile floor without hesitation, without shame. She began gathering pieces of tray, wiping soup with napkin she pulled from the dispenser, her hands as steady as a neurosurgeon's. Around her, people looked away. People suddenly became very interested in their sandwiches. People pretended they hadn't witnessed a man use casual cruelty the way other people use salt. She looked up at Sterling from the floor. "I've stitched men back together under mortar fire," she said, her voice exactly like glacial ice, cold, precise, infinitely heavy. Men with abdominal wounds that opened them like books. Men with femoral artery damage, bleeding out faster than we could replace fluid. I kept them alive on the floor of a field hospital in Helmand Province with nothing but training and hands that wouldn't shake. She paused. She stood. She held the garbage in one hand, dripping and ruined. "Your tantrum doesn't even register." The cafeteria erupted. Not into applause. Into something sharper, a collective intake of breath, a sudden understanding that the quiet nurse with the sparse background and the careful movements had just revealed something lethal beneath her composure. Sterling's face went the color of raw liver. His jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists, then slowly, very slowly, opened again. He turned and walked out without speaking. Brooke disposed of the garbage. She purchased a replacement lunch with cash from her pocket. She sat in the corner window seat and ate her second turkey sandwich while the cafeteria slowly returned to the normal sounds of forks and conversation, but different now, aware. Conscious. Changed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened 5 hours later, at 17:45, when Code Blue erupted in Trauma Bay 3 and every hand that could move did move, and Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the bedside of a 41-year-old woman with an acute MI, her oxygen saturation dropping to dangerous lows, her cardiac output collapsing, and he couldn't seem to remember what came next. Brooke was already moving, her hands gathering suture packs, her voice calling out complications with military precision. Sterling recovered his mind and his voice. He barked orders. He demanded specific instruments with the wrong sizes, then blamed Brooke when she handed him the packet he'd requested. During the chaos, as the patient's heart rate climbed and the attending tried to stabilize her, Sterling hurled the patient chart at Brooke's feet. Papers exploded across the floor. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice tight with rage that had nothing to do with the patient and everything to do with a cafeteria full of witnesses and the understanding that he had tried to diminish someone and failed. "If you can't handle basic supply management, maybe you should go back to whatever backwater clinic gave you a reference." Brooke crouched. She began gathering papers, her hand shaking for the first time since he'd arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. But not from fear. From restraint. From the understanding that her hands, when they moved on their own, knew how to do things that made this man look like a child throwing a tantrum. She stood. She handed him the chart. "The patient is still coding, doctor," she said quietly. "Sodium levels are critical." Sterling blinked. The patient did matter. He turned back to the monitor, back to the body on the stretcher, back to the work of medicine. Brooke stepped back, her breathing controlled, her face carefully blank. But she had noticed something in that moment when Sterling's attention fractured. She had noticed his eyes on her work, on her hands, on the way she moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd trained for this under conditions far worse than a hospital emergency. She'd noticed him calculating something. Deciding something. That night, unable to sleep, Brooke sat in her car in the parking garage of Oak Creek Memorial and opened the personnel file she'd borrowed from medical records. She pulled up Sterling's billing records on her laptop, the ones accessible through the hospital's shared database. She cross-referenced them against actual patient charts. Phantom surgeries began appearing at 15:37 p.m. By 16:22 p.m., she had identified 11 discrepancies. By 16:45, she had photographed them all on her phone camera. Medication orders that didn't match actual dispensations. Consultation codes billed as major procedures. Insurance claims that inflated by factors of 3 and 4 and 5. $20,000 here. $35,000 there. Enough money to fund a vacation home in Coronado, which, Brooke discovered by Googling his name at 1702, Sterling had purchased 6 months ago. She copied the files to an encrypted USB drive she kept in her glove compartment, the same drive that contained her discharge papers, her service record, her medals in PDF format, the documents she never quite had the courage to delete. Fraud was something she understood. Fraud was something that could be proven. Fraud was something she could document in the way the military had taught her, building an unshakable case before making her move. She just had to wait for the right moment. The moment arrived at 3:14 a.m. on day 7, when an ambulance pulled into Oak Creek Memorial's emergency bay and paramedics emerged with a Marine in critical condition, shrapnel wounds bleeding through bandages already soaked through with dark, arterial blood. Brooke was assigned to Trauma Bay 2 as the attending physician began his assessment. The Marine, Corporal Jensen, according to his ID, had training accident wounds from Camp Pendleton that looked far more like combat injuries, and his eyes, even through the fog of shock and blood loss, found Brooke's the moment she entered the room. She knew that look. She had seen it in mirrors that no longer showed her reflection. 2 nights later, the ambulance bay doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a 24-year-old with a knife wound 3 inches below his left collarbone. Blood soaked through 3 layers of gauze. His name was Marcus Sterling, and he was the doctor's nephew. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, a competent trauma surgeon who usually moved with decisive speed, examined the wound, listened to lung sounds, pressed 2 fingers against Marcus's neck. His movement slowed. Then stopped. "Distended neck veins," Chen said quietly. "Heart sounds are muffled." Brooke was already moving. She had heard those clinical findings before, in a field hospital outside San Juan Valley where a 19-year-old Marine from Atlanta took shrapnel in the chest cavity and the blood couldn't escape. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac filling with blood, pressure building, the heart suffocating in its own fluid. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. The attending looked at the monitor, looked at the blood pressure dropping from 105 to 98, and his next words confirmed what Brooke already knew. "We need a surgeon." "Cardiothoracic is," Chen reached for the phone. 12 minutes, Brooke said. Not a question. She was already pulling a spinal needle from the crash cart, 18 gauge, the kind used for lumbar punctures. The kind that worked just fine for emergencies. He'll be in arrest before they get down here. She didn't wait for permission. That was the part that would matter later, though Brooke didn't know it yet. She prepped the chest with betadine in 4 seconds, the brown iodine solution spreading across the skin in practiced lines, and her fingers found the landmarks by touch alone. 4th intercostal space. Between the ribs. Below the xiphoid process. Pain was information. Silence was control. The needle went in. 60 milliliters of blood drained into the syringe. Dark blood, old blood, the kind that meant pressure had been building for hours. Marcus's blood pressure jumped. 115, 118. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His oxygen saturation climbed from 84 to 91 to 97%. The room stopped holding its breath. "Get me a chest tube kit," Chen said, his voice steady again. "And call CT. We're moving to surgery." The ER erupted in the controlled chaos of a saved life, staff calling out vitals, running labs, prepping the transport gurney. Nurses moved in synchronized patterns, each one knowing their part. The crisis had transformed into procedure. The patient would live. Dr. Sterling arrived 3 minutes later, while Brooke was still removing her gloves, the used needle already in the biohazard container, the evidence of what she'd done sealed away. His eyes went to his nephew first, to Marcus's steady blood pressure on the monitor, to the color returning to his face, to the fact that his nephew was breathing. Relief flickered across Sterling's face for maybe half a second. Then he looked at Brooke. His eyes tracked from her face to the empty syringe on the tray, to the betadine stains on her scrubs, to the needle cap she had just removed. The relief vanished. Replaced by something colder. Something that looked like calculation wrapped in rage. "Who authorized that procedure?" His voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting. Quiet voices carried authority. "Sullivan, you're a nurse. Not a physician. That's practicing medicine without a license." Chen stepped forward. "I was initiating the call for." "I'm asking her," Sterling said, without looking away from Brooke. Brooke stripped off her gloves. One hand, then the other. The latex snapped like gunshots in the sudden silence. She met his eyes, and held them with the kind of composure that came from having already survived worse. Much worse. Places where raised voices meant incoming fire and hesitation meant body bags. "He had 3 minutes," she said. Her voice was level. No apology. No justification. Just facts. The attending froze. "Marcus would be dead if I waited for a cardiologist." Sterling stepped closer. Close enough that only she could hear his next words. Close enough that his breath carried the smell of expensive coffee and something underneath it that smelled like anger being forced down into a container it was too large for. "You just made me look incompetent in front of my entire staff. That was a mistake." He left before she could respond. Just turned and walked back toward the surgical floor, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the precision of someone made of barely controlled fury. Brooke watched him go, and something in her chest, some part that had been asleep for 12 years, woke up and recognized a threat being calculated. What she didn't know was that Sterling had already started making phone calls. The first call came at 6:41 a.m., 23 minutes after Marcus had been transferred to surgery, before Brooke even clocked out. Sterling sat in his office with his door closed and dialed a board member named Raymond Holloway, a man who owed him a favor from 3 years earlier when Sterling had helped bury a malpractice suit involving Holloway's surgical error. A case that should have ended in revocation. That had ended in a signed NDA and a check for $147,000. "I need to discuss a situation at Oak Creek," Sterling said. His voice was calm. Professional. A man solving problems, not a man driven by rage. One of the nurses, Brooke Sullivan, night shift, just performed an unauthorized medical procedure on a patient without physician authorization. Cardiac intervention. Textbook grounds for termination. "I'm planning to file a formal complaint, but I wanted to give you a heads up before HR gets involved." The call lasted 90 seconds. The second call went to a reference listed on Brooke's employment application, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hendricks in Missoula, Montana, someone who had known Brooke years ago, before the uniform, before everything changed. Sterling dialed the number and introduced himself as Director of Critical Care at a major trauma center, saying he was conducting a routine reference check for a promotion opportunity. "Brooke Sullivan," he said. "You listed her as a previous supervisor." How would you characterize her decision-making under pressure? Any concerns about her judgment? Any history of, say, overstepping her scope of practice? Hendricks, caught off guard and trying to be helpful, mentioned that Brooke had left her position somewhat suddenly, that there had been some interpersonal friction with administration, that she was very independent-minded. That was all Sterling needed. A seed planted. A suggestion that Brooke Sullivan had a pattern of pushing boundaries. The third call came at 7:33 a.m. to the hospital's chief medical officer. Sterling reported a serious concern about pharmacy audits for night-shift narcotics. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He just suggested that someone, he wasn't pointing fingers, might be diverting controlled substances. That the documentation on overnight medication logs had been irregular. That there was a pattern he'd noticed. "I'm not trying to make anyone look bad," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man with no choice but to speak up. "But we have a fiduciary responsibility. I'd recommend a full audit." By the time Brooke finished her shift and drove home through the San Diego dawn, watching the sky turn from gray to pink over the Pacific, hospital administration had already initiated a formal review of night-shift pharmacy records. Within 48 hours, investigators would arrive with documentation protocols and questions. Within 72 hours, they would inform Brooke Sullivan that they had found discrepancies in her medication charting and were initiating a formal inquiry into her practice. Sterling had not accused her of anything. He hadn't needed to. He had simply created the machinery, aimed it, and let gravity do the work. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. Brooke still had 6 more days before her world came down completely. By Friday afternoon, the hospital administration had completed their work. Brooke stood in the employee parking lot holding a cardboard box that contained everything she'd accumulated in 18 months at Oak Creek Memorial, a framed photograph of her daughter, a spare sweater she kept for overnight shifts, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth and untouched since the day she'd buried her old life, a pair of worn combat boots with laces still caked in the dust of Helmand Province. Her badge was gone. Security had confiscated it at 2:44 p.m., the plastic lanyard dangling from the guard's hand like a trophy. The accusation had been surgical in its precision, narcotic discrepancies in the medication logs. Oxycodone counts that didn't match pharmacy records. Fentanyl patches signed out but never documented as administered. Perfect paper trails that Dr. Sterling's calls to the board had ensured would be taken seriously. When Brooke had tried to explain that the logs were fabricated, that Sterling had planted false documentation to discredit her, the hospital administrator had simply looked past her, through her, the way you look at a stain you don't want to acknowledge. "The investigation is closed," the woman had said. "Security will escort you from the premises. We'll be forwarding this matter to the California Medical Board." Brooke hadn't trembled. Hadn't argued. She'd simply nodded, packed her box, and walked toward the glass doors that led out to the parking lot. Behind her, colleagues had carefully looked away. Some of them had worked beside her for months without knowing her name, just the night nurse or Brooke from the ICU. Now they knew her as a thief. A criminal. The quiet efficiency of the destruction was almost impressive. Sterling had transformed a woman who saved lives into someone the hospital was desperate to forget, all within 72 hours. The drive home had been silent except for the radio, which she'd left off. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady. "Pain is data," her old commanding officer used to say during trauma cases. "Use it. Don't fight it." She'd used that principle for 15 years in field hospitals and 12 years teaching combat medicine before the PTSD had finally won, before she'd decided that her greatest service would be disappearing into a life where no one asked questions. She'd been wrong about that. The questions had found her anyway. That evening, at 1900 hours, Marine Corporal Marcus Jensen was discharged from Oak Creek Memorial with a course of oral antibiotics, instructions for wound care, and a prescription for oxycodone that his attending physician had been careful to personally verify in the presence of 2 nurses. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He had healing to do, the shrapnel wounds were clean, the infection risk minimal, the trauma to his body significant enough that pain management wasn't optional. He'd asked the discharge nurse if there was any way to reach Brooke Sullivan. The nurse had looked uncomfortable and said, "I'm not sure she works here anymore." Jensen had taken the elevator down to the parking garage on the hospital's east side, a concrete structure that smelled of diesel exhaust and brake fluid, his movements careful because his ribs still screamed with every breath. His ride, a fellow Marine named Gator who drove a rusted F-150, was supposed to be waiting at the Level 2 exit. The parking garage was dimly lit at sunset, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made time feel suspended. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar near the stairwell. Jensen recognized him immediately, though the guy was thinner than he remembered, his face scarred on one side and wearing the particular expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. Marcus Chen. The brother of the gang member who'd come at Jensen with a knife 3 weeks earlier. That patient had coded in the trauma bay, not from his injuries but from an untreated infection that had gone septic. He died while waiting for lab results that the hospital's admin had somehow misfiled. His family had blamed the hospital. His family had blamed Jenkins. His family had been waiting. "You put my brother down," Marcus said. His voice sounded like gravel in a garbage disposal. Jensen's hands went up. "Man, I didn't." The first shot was a percussion that echoed wrong off concrete. It went wide, the round punching through a car window for spaces down. Jensen dove behind a Toyota Camry, his healing ribs sending lightning down his side. His training kicked in immediately, return fire position, scan for exits, call for help. But he had no weapon. He had discharge papers and a bottle of pills. The second shot came as Marcus advanced, his body moving with the grim determination of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed for weeks. It hit the Toyota's side panel. Jensen was reaching for his phone when he heard it, not the third shot, but the sound before it. Boots on concrete. Running. Brooke Sullivan was crossing the parking garage to her Honda Civic when the first shot cracked the silence. Her body had already begun moving before her mind caught up, 18 years of muscle memory overriding 18 months of civilian identity. She sprinted toward the sound, her movements quick despite the stiffness in her bandaged ribs, and saw Jensen pressed behind a vehicle with a shooter advancing, the man's arm extended, his expression locked in that particular kind of rage that blinds you to consequences. She didn't call out. Didn't announce herself. She simply ran faster and hit Jensen like a linebacker, driving him backward and down, covering him with her body at the exact moment the second shot detonated. The round entered her left shoulder from above, a burning punch that spun her and tore through muscle and bone. She felt it hit like someone had driven a railroad spike through her collarbone. "Run," she gasped. "Go. Now." The third shot came before Jensen could move. It hit her ribs on the right side, cracking at least one bone and tearing through soft tissue with a sensation like being punched with a sledgehammer covered in fire. She screamed, not in fear but in that command voice that had called Marines to attention in Marja, in that voice that had ordered men to hold pressure while she'd stitched them together under mortar fire. "Move, Jensen." "That's an order." The fourth shot came lower, punching through her abdomen, and she felt the hot bloom of internal bleeding, the sensation of something fundamental breaking inside her. Her vision tunneled. The pain was information. The pain told her she had minutes, maybe less. She pressed down harder onto Jensen, covering every angle of his body with her own, and screamed again, "Run. Go." In a voice so raw it didn't sound human. Footsteps. Shouting. A security guard emerged from the stairwell with his hand on his holster, finally, and the shooter bolted, throwing the weapon behind a concrete pillar and running for the east exit. Jensen was scrambling backward, but Brooke grabbed his collar with a hand that wouldn't obey her properly anymore, wouldn't stop shaking despite her absolute refusal to let it shake. "You're clear," she managed. "You're alive. Stay alive." The concrete was cold under her cheek. The bleeding had begun to pool, a dark stain spreading like spilled coffee across the oil-stained pavement. Jensen was screaming for a corpsman, the word echoing in the parking garage like a prayer. Brooke's vision was going dark at the edges now, the tunnel narrowing to a pinpoint. She could taste copper. She could hear sirens, actually hear them, not imagine them, which meant they were close, which meant she'd done it right, which meant... The darkness took her before she could finish the thought. 2 days later, she opened her eyes in the ICU. 3 drain tubes connected her abdomen to collection boxes that she tried not to look at. And 4 line was delivering morphine on a PCA pump, patient-controlled analgesia, which meant she could push the button and fall back into the dark, and she did, frequently, because the alternative was staying awake in a body that felt like someone had tried to disassemble it with a knife and pliers. 32 stitches in her abdomen. 17 in her shoulder. 2 broken ribs. A transfusion of 4 units of packed red blood cells. The surgeons had explained it all with a particular detachment of people who did this work often enough that it had become routine. For them. Not for her. 4 days later, against medical advice, she signed the discharge papers. The AMA form, the liability waiver, all of it. The nurses didn't try to stop her, they'd already gotten their stories about her alleged theft, already knew she was the kind of person who put other people above herself, and nurses were very good at recognizing their own kind. One of them, a woman named Patricia who'd worked the day shift, brought her a wheelchair without being asked. The drive home was the same silence as before, except now her left arm was essentially immobilized, and her rib sent fire through her body with every breath and every small bump in the road. She took the medication they'd given her and didn't ask what it was. She just wanted to sleep and not dream about parking garages. Her daughter found her the next morning at the kitchen table, still in bandages, still in the clothes she'd worn home from the hospital, with fresh tears on her face that she was trying to wipe away before anyone could see them. The child was 7 years old and far too smart to miss the signs that something catastrophic had happened. "Mommy, why are you home early?" the girl asked, and her voice was so small and confused that Brooke couldn't answer. She just pulled her daughter close, carefully, and held her, and hated herself for letting the girl see her like this, broken, useless, too damaged to protect her anymore. But that was before the engines came. That was before the entire street shook. That was before the silence of her small house became the least quiet place she'd ever been. 1 week after the shooting, Brooke Sullivan was feeding her daughter breakfast when the thunder of engines shook the windows. Not car engines. Diesel. Heavy. The kind that made windows rattle in their frames and spoons clink against cereal bowls. Her daughter looked up, milk mustache on her upper lip, confusion crossing her face. Brooke set down her coffee mug, moved by muscle memory, not conscious thought, and walked to the front window. What she saw stopped her breathing. A convoy. Military vehicles. 3 Hums and 2 transport trucks lined up on Maple Street in their quiet San Diego neighborhood, engines idling like predators that had just decided to stay. Behind them, standing in perfect formation across her lawn and the lawns of 3 neighbors, were exactly 100 Marines in dress blue uniforms. Not working uniforms. Not training clothes. Dress blues with white gloves and dress covers, the kind of uniform you wore when something official was about to happen. Their boots were positioned heel to toe, each Marine standing at parade rest with their hands clasped behind their backs. Every single one of them was looking at her house. Brooke's jaw clenched. Once. She forced it to relax. Her daughter appeared at her side, small fingers gripping the windowsill. "Mommy?" "Why?" Then the doorbell rang. Not a ring. 3 deliberate chimes that echoed through the house like a command being issued. Brooke's daughter looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much fear in the past week. Brooke nodded once, just once, and watched her daughter walk to the door with the tentative steps of a child who was learning that the world didn't always make sense. She opened it. And gasped. A lieutenant colonel stood on the porch. 6'2". Weathered face that looked like it had spent months in Helmand Province. Dress blue so crisp they could have cut glass. His eyes found Brooke's across the living room, and his hand came up. Not a casual wave. A salute. His right hand, fingertips at the brim of his cover, held with the kind of precision that said he had been doing this for 40 years. Her daughter's voice came out small and confused. "Mom, why is he saluting you?" The lieutenant colonel stepped forward, boots landing heavy on the wooden porch, the sound of something official arriving. His voice carried across the lawn, projected so that every Marine could hear him. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. He lowered his salute and looked directly at her. Marine Corporal Jensen told his entire battalion what you did. 3 bullets meant for him are now in your body. And not one of us will let that stand unremarked. The Marines didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there, 100 pairs of boots planted on suburban grass, an impossible statement of gratitude in formation. The morning sun caught their brass insignia and threw light across the street like a deliberate benediction. Brooke didn't cry. Didn't falter. She stepped forward and extended her hand. The lieutenant colonel took it, and his grip was the grip of someone who knew exactly what her hands had done. What they had saved. Corporal Jensen is a good Marine, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave from the woman Dr. Sterling had known. This was a different voice. Older. Colder. Tell him I said he better not miss PT. The lieutenant colonel smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from understanding someone completely. He won't, Senior Chief. And then the rotor wash hit them all at once. A helicopter descended from the eastern sky, an MH-60 Black Hawk, painted in desert tan and government grey, and it set down in the street with the absolute certainty of something that did not care about traffic laws or civilian airspace. The door gunner was visible in the side door. Armed. Ready. Not threatening anyone. Just present. Just saying without words, this woman matters enough to bring a helicopter to a residential street in San Diego. Brooke watched the helicopter land. Watched her neighbors emerge from their houses, stood frozen in their driveways, watching 100 Marines and a combat aircraft arrive at her address like the world was correcting itself. Her daughter's hand found hers and squeezed. Brooke squeezed back once. Where? She asked the lieutenant colonel. Oak Creek Memorial. Dr. Sterling is holding a press conference at 1100 hours. We want him to see us arrive. Brooke nodded. No questions. No hesitation. She turned to her daughter. Go get Mrs. Chen from next door. Tell her mommy has to go to work for a few hours. Tell her, she paused, choosing her words with precision. Tell her the Marines came to say thank you. By 10:55 hours, the convoy was rolling toward Oak Creek Memorial. 100 Marines in dress blues, standing in truck beds with the kind of practiced balance that came from years of operations in countries Brooke would never speak about. The helicopter followed overhead, its shadow moving across the city streets like something written in ink. Dr. Sterling was at the main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial, standing in front of a hastily assembled press conference. News cameras. 3 microphones. A podium with the hospital's logo on it. He was wearing a suit, expensive, pressed, the kind of suit that announced you were someone important. His hair was gelled. His smile was practiced. He was talking about unfortunate violence in their community, about the need for better security measures at medical facilities, about the hospital's commitment to healing and compassion. He never mentioned Brooke. He never mentioned that he had her fired. The rotor wash hit the parking lot first. The sound. The physical force of a Black Hawk at treetop level coming straight down toward the hospital entrance like judgment descending from the sky. The news cameras swung toward the sound. The microphones caught the noise and fed it into the broadcast feed, helicopter, rotors, the absolute authority of military presence arriving at a civilian hospital in the middle of the afternoon. Dr. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. His hand froze on the microphone. His mouth was still open, still mid-word, but no sound came out. The helicopter landed on the parking lot asphalt. The Marines dismounted with the synchronized precision of units that had done this in Kandahar and Fallujah and 100 other places where precision meant people came home alive. 100 of them, moving like a single organism, formed ranks on the hospital property. Dress blues. White gloves. Dress covers perfectly aligned. The rotor wash began to slow. A 2-star general descended from the helicopter, Major General Catherine Holloway, 3rd Marine Division, with a chest full of ribbons and eyes that had seen classified things and made decisions that changed history. She walked directly toward the press conference. Not around it. Directly through it. The news cameras tracked her. The reporters recognized the rank insignia and knew something had just shifted on their timeline. This was no longer a story about hospital security. This was a story that would lead the 6 o'clock news. The general stepped up to the podium. Dr. Sterling tried to hold his ground, but something in her posture, something in the way she moved like a weapon that had decided to be still, made him step backward. She took the microphone from his hand. Not aggressive. Calm. Like someone removing a toy from a child who didn't understand what he was holding. The nurse your hospital fired for alleged narcotic theft is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. The general's voice was clear, measured, the voice of someone used to giving orders that would be obeyed without question. She is a decorated combat medic with 2 Navy Crosses and a Silver Star for Valor in Helmand Province. She is one of the most qualified emergency medicine nurses in this hospital's history. And your administration fired her without investigation. Dr. Sterling's face went white. Not red. Not flushed. A specific kind of white that came from understanding, in a single moment, that everything was about to end. She was fired, the general continued, because she discovered your insurance fraud. The United States Marine Corps has triggered a federal investigation into your billing practices. We have documented evidence of phantom surgeries, inflated medication orders, and systematic insurance fraud dating back 18 months. You destroyed this woman's career to cover your theft. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth. Now wait. You don't speak, the general said. Her voice didn't rise. It simply became heavier, denser, like pressure increasing at depth. The nurse who saved Marine Corporal Jensen, who took 3 bullets while bleeding on concrete, while under false accusation, uncovered your scheme. And then you retaliated by fabricating charges. She turned to hospital security, standing frozen at the entrance. Remove Dr. Sterling from the premises. He is under investigation by federal authorities. If you allow him to remain, your hospital is obstructing a federal investigation. 2 security officers moved forward. Dr. Sterling tried to back away, his hands up, but there was nowhere to go. The general's presence had filled the entire space. The news cameras captured every second. His hands shaking. His mouth opening and closing with no words coming out. The specific humiliation of being removed from your own institution while news cameras documented your descent from authority to irrelevance. The FBI will be here within the hour, a Marine captain said, stepping forward with a USB drive held up so the cameras could see it. We found this in Senior Chief Sullivan's vehicle. Every record. Every fraudulent claim. Every piece of documentation she gathered while your hospital was accusing her of crimes she didn't commit. The Marine stood at parade rest, 100 pairs of boots planted on hospital property, a silent statement of what happened when you hurt someone under their watch. When you tried to destroy someone's career out of spite. When you attacked a warrior and pretended you didn't know what you were attacking. Dr. Sterling was escorted out of the building by security, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't unlock his car. His suit was the same expensive suit. His hair was still gelled. But the authority was gone. The institutional power had been removed like a tumor. By the time his shoes hit the pavement outside the hospital entrance, he was just a man in an expensive suit who had made the mistake of attacking someone under her brother's watch. 6 months later, Brooke Sullivan was picking up her daughter from school when she walked past a strip mall on 6th Avenue. The afternoon sun was hitting the storefront windows, and in one of them, sitting at a folding table with a handwritten banner, was Dr. Sterling. The banner read, "Discount Insurance, ask me how." He was wearing a polo shirt with the insurance company logo embroidered on the pocket. His hair was no longer gelled. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he was looking at nothing in particular until his eyes found her. 1 second. That was all it took. 1 second where his eyes met hers and he saw her walking past him, past his folding table, past his discount insurance job, with her daughter's hand in one of hers and the bearing of someone who had survived things that would have broken him. 1 second where he understood, completely and without question, that she had won. That he had lost. That all the institutional power he had wielded meant nothing when it was weighed against her courage. Brooke didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't even turn her head. She simply continued walking, her daughter chattering beside her about something that had happened at school, about her best friend and a math test and what they were going to have for dinner. At home, the worn combat boots sat on the fireplace mantel, finally unpacked from their cloth wrapping. They sat in a place of honor, flanked by her navy crosses in their presentation cases and her silver star on a ribbon. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. The soles were worn from 1,000 patrols and operations and moments where those boots had carried her through darkness that most people would never have to imagine. Her daughter had started asking about them. Asking what it meant. Why they mattered. Brooke was learning to tell the stories now, slowly, the nightmares coming less frequently when she spoke them aloud instead of keeping them locked away in the dark places where fear lived. The boots on the mantel were no longer something to hide. They were something to understand. Brooke stood at her window, watching her daughter play in the backyard. Her hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her abdomen where one of the 3 bullets had entered. The scar was pale now, still numb in places, but it didn't hurt anymore. The physical pain had faded. The guilt, that was what took longer. The guilt of being alive. The guilt of being safe while others were not. That's what the boots taught her, sitting there in the afternoon light. You survived for a reason. You survived so you could carry forward what mattered. Her phone buzzed. A text from the Lieutenant Colonel, Senior Chief, we have 3 combat medics transitioning out. They need guidance. Can you meet with them? Brooke typed back, send them my way. She had learned something in that parking garage, bleeding on concrete, her body shielding someone else's. Hiding from her past didn't heal her. Standing up. Speaking truth. Teaching others what she had learned, that was what healed her. That was what made the nightmares come less often. That was what made her daughter see her mother as someone to be proud of, instead of someone to be afraid for. Oak Creek Memorial had created a position for her. Emergency Department Clinical Director. A position designed specifically to teach other nurses, other medics, other people who carried weight that nobody could see. Brooke had said yes without hesitation. Because that's what senior chiefs did. They led. They taught. They made sure the next generation understood that heroism wasn't about the uniform. It wasn't about the recognition or the medals or the press conferences where generals announced your value to the world. It was about what you did when nobody was watching. What you did when it cost you. What you did when staying quiet would have been easier, safer, less painful than standing in front of the truth and refusing to look away. The combat boots caught the afternoon light coming through the window, and Brooke spoke the words that would become her motto, the thing she would tell every veteran who walked through her office door looking for a reason to believe they still mattered: you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. 100 Marines had proven that truth by standing in formation on her lawn. Now she would spend the rest of her life teaching it to others. If you found this story about hidden strength and quiet heroism resonating with you, hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything. Like this video if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, even when the cost is high. And comment below, what would you do if you discovered the person you were sitting next to had already survived the worst? Let me know. I read every comment.